Hello and welcome to the 2020 virtual edition of Words. I'm Joshua Lambier, the artistic director of the festival, coming to you live from Museum London in London, Ontario. It's my privilege to have the opportunity to host tonight's distinguished guest, New York Times-bestselling author Adam Gopnik, who will be joining us to talk about his new book, Thousand Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism. As we stay home to stay safe, the Words Festival is coming to you, to the safety and comfort of your home, to bring the brightest writers who are grappling with issues of pressing concern and confronting big ideas. At a time when our public debate is being mediated too often by 240-character volleys back and forth on Twitter, we want to step out of the fray for a moment for in-depth conversations with our authors, tarrying a while to focus attention on their books. Over the next hour or so, we're going to have a conversation on issues that matter, and we're going to take your questions in chat and on the webinar's Q&A function, so send along your cogitations and questions to join in the discussion. I'd like to start us off tonight with a short thought experiment. To borrow a phrase from the Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, I'm going to ask you to perform a willing suspension of disbelief. Imagine, if you will, you lived in a society that was deeply polarized, that had soaring levels of inequality, that had a political administration that questioned basic facts, that vilified the news media, that delegitimized the achievements of modern science, that attacked reason, that undermined the democratic process of voting. That was the hard-won achievement of centuries of progressive liberal struggle for greater levels of inclusion. To be clear, this is a hypothetical scenario, of course. Now imagine this society, hypothetical as it is, was also beset with a series of crises like a once-in-a-century pandemic, climate change, an economic downturn, and the emergence of national protests over systematic racial injustice. If you were to find yourself as a member of this imagined community, or hypothetically, a neighbor to this frayed social reality, how would you restore the common practices and foundational stories, the political and social institutions, or even the very moral order after such storm-tossed upheaval? How could a well-timed defense of the liberal tradition offer much-needed insight and a boost of morale for the road ahead? To help us take on these weighty questions emerging from our thought experiment, it is a real pleasure to welcome someone who I and many others regard as America's and Canada's finest cultural critics. He has been a staff writer for The New Yorker for over 30 years, where he has won numerous national magazine awards for his essays and criticism. He is also the author of numerous best-selling books that have an uncanny ability to carry the intellectual power of scholarly writing and yet the elegance and commitment of an engaged essayist. Adam Gopnik, welcome to the Words Festival.
Josh, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be, even virtually, back in London, as I was explaining to you before in the green room, so to speak, before we got started. My wife, Martha, and I have had wonderful times in London back when we used to visit one of her cousins and go off to Stratford. In fact, as you probably know, my true passion in life is the theater, and I actually remember going from London to see single best evening of theater I've ever seen, Maggie Smith and Brian Bedford in Robin Phillips' production of As You Like It, and coming back dazzled. So I have nothing but the most loving memories of London. And as I was also explaining, my parents live on their unique and eccentric domain in Campbellford, which is not a million miles away. So I feel, even though I'm stuck here in my New York study, I feel very much at home in your part of the world.
Well, in Southern Ontario, you have a welcome place, and we were so thrilled that you were able to join us. I would like to kick us off by sharing an image. I had a chance to share this very briefly with Adam just before we went live in the Zoom green room. A fixture of London, this work is called The White Rhino by London artist Tom Benner, and is a full-sized handmade sculpture comprised of aluminum panels pop-riveted together. Had we been able to welcome you in person to Words, you would have walked right past London's iconic White Rhino to present here in the museum. Now, one of the orienting claims or metaphors, rather, you propose in the book is to argue liberalism is a rhinoceros. So let's start there. Can you tell us about the analogy you have drawn between the liberal tradition and the rhino?
Sure, I love that, and that's a great rhino too. I can just, if only we could do this live, I would have gotten a picture in front of it and sent it on the FAM text, if not on Twitter. So the idea of the rhino came to me when I was thinking about the greatest couple, if you like, in the history of liberalism. That's John Stuart Mill, who by universal acclamation is the greatest of all liberal thinkers in the 19th century, 1830s through the 1870s in London, and the woman whom he thought of as the greatest liberal thinker, Harriet Taylor, his lover and then eventually his wife. And it's one of those nice feminist notes that for most of history, people, as I say in the book, had tried to Yoko Harriet Taylor and say, oh, she wasn't really that significant a thinker. John Stuart Mill always said she was the smartest, the wisest person I knew, and everything I understand she taught me. And only in relatively recent years, through an efflorescence of feminist scholarship, have we begun to understand that he was right. He was telling the truth about the quality of her mind. And when they were courting clandestinely, because she was married and had 3 children, they had fallen in love over a dinner party in London, they would send each other notes to say, you know, meet me in the here or there. And their favorite place to meet was by the rhino's cage in the London Zoo. The rhino, I did a little good due diligence in graduate student. It actually arrived in 1826. This is taking place in the 1830s. So it was still a new wonder. And they had realized with the kind of special acuity that only philosophers and major thinkers can have, that the bench outside the rhino's cage was the perfect place to meet because everyone would be looking at the rhino and no one would be looking at the 2 philosophers canoodling on the bench. And that was where they met and where all of the ideas for what, to my mind, are the 2, or certainly among the 2 great pillars of liberal thinking were produced. On the one hand, John Stuart Mill's great 1859 book on liberty, and the book that they wrote together, really, came out tragically after Harriet's death, on the subjection of women. Pillars for me, Josh, of liberalism, because On Liberty is the greatest statement of the need for absolute liberty, the greatest statement for freedom of expression and freedom of speech that's ever been written, so much so that many libertarians claim it is their holy book. But On the Subjection of Women is among the greatest statements for social action. It's a call not to individualism, but it's a call to collective social action on behalf of an oppressed majority, in that case, on behalf of women. So those 2 pillars of the liberal vision, totally affirming individual liberty, at the same time turning towards the necessity of social reform, were given birth there in front of the rhino's cage of the London Zoo. And as I was brooding on this wonderful couple, who I love to think about, it occurred to me that the rhino was the perfect heraldic image, perfect heraldic animal of liberalism, exactly because if you think about it, what is a rhinoceros? A rhinoceros is the actuality of the unicorn. A unicorn is an imaginary beast, and everyone knows that it was medieval travelers going to Africa and coming back and sort of cleaning up and cosmeticizing, improving, making utopian the unicorn that gave this myth of the beautiful animal, the beautiful white horse with the golden horn in the center of its forehead. And unicorns are gorgeous and beautiful, and we put them up in children's rooms and on posters, and the problem with them is they don't exist. Rhinoceri, the real, actual living equivalent of the unicorn, they are ugly, they are squat, they are unattractive, they have no glamour at all, and yet they're formidable animals. And that, for me, captured, in a way that I think the last few days have reinforced for us, the reality that the liberal vision, by which I mean not the Liberal Party of Canada, obviously, but the liberal democratic vision of Mill and Taylor and their coevals, rests on the notion that profound and radical and essential change can take place through incremental steps, can take place through a legislative reform, and that, ugly though that often is, unsatisfying to our need for the glamour of a utopian vision, it is historically incomparably more successful. For the same reason that the rhino, ugly as it is a far more fascinating animal than the unicorn, imaginary as it is, exactly because the rhino exists. The rhino exists, and the power of liberal reform historically exists as well.
Yes, terrific. What I find especially compelling about your approach to the question, big question, what is liberalism, is the way you swerve from the usual suspects of political histories, for example, the 17th and 18th century English philosophers or politicians, or the ideas of individual liberties and social contracts, to focus our attention on couples and communities, lived experiences and passionate stories. And you've chosen the genre of the adventure to tell a new story of liberalism. As a literary scholar myself, when I see the word adventure as a structuring frame, I think of stories with heroic quest narratives. How does the genre of the adventure open up new horizons for us to tell the story of liberalism?
You must be a very good professor, Josh, because you put your finger on something that I was trying to seed, and I wasn't sure I had put across. It was exactly the notion, and of course the frame of this book, both fictively, because it is a frame, but actually as well, is that I was writing a letter to my daughter Olivia, who was freaked out by the election of Donald Trump 4 years ago. And I wanted to explain to her what the liberal humanist values were that I held, where they came from, and why I believed in them. Not just because they were a family inheritance. We root for the Montreal Canadiens, even though we live in New York, because that's a family inheritance. We believe in liberal humanist values, I was saying to her, because they're true, because we can argue for them. And so, exactly as you say, the standard vision of liberalism that you're going to get in high school or in college tends to emphasize exactly the people you're talking about, Locke and Montesquieu, great thinkers, no doubt, but who have a very, if you like, legalistic, contractual vision of what liberalism is. And as a consequence, it tends to drain all the human drama from it. And when we compare the stories of the great liberals to the stories of the great radicals, for instance, they lose, or can seem to lose, a lot of the humanity, the emotional valence that we are drawn to always. So that was why I chose adventure. And I also wanted to choose, exactly as you say, couples and communities. I wanted to talk about John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor, their struggle about their love. You know, they fell in love. If you can imagine, in early Victorian period, she's married, he's not. They're desperately in love. What are they going to do with this love? And they have to craft a compromise that will care for her children and her wife, at the same time honor their love. And it has many, as inevitably happens in the real world, comic consequences. They ended up going off to Paris together. And Mill, very gallantly, always insisted that they had no carnal contact in Paris. I find that hard to believe. I mean, anyone goes to Paris for a week and stays in a hotel. And they ended up, he would pay for the wine while her husband would pay for the board and so on. But they pulled together this beautiful compromise. And compromise is one of the key concepts of liberal politics. And compromise is something that we always tend to deprecate. We always say, oh, well, the best they could do was this compromise. And I was thinking, no, the most beautiful thing that they could arrive at was this compromise. A compromise is a knot tied tight between competing decencies. It's a way for us to honor Harriet Taylor's husband and honor her love for John Stuart Mill. And that's a principle of human conduct that we can extend into our political engagements, our social world. So that's a moral adventure of a kind. And I wanted to take all of those smaller moral adventures, the moral adventure, and again, in the 19th century, I write about at length, which I think is surprising in a book about liberalism, of George Eliot and G.H. Lewis. We all know George Eliot is a great novelist, but she's one of the great liberal thinkers, thinking about process, how processes happen in all of the world's literature. If you think about what happens in, forgive me, but you're an English professor, as was my dad, so I'll pull this out. Middlemarch, a monument of English literature. But what's it all about? It's about how people change, right? Dorothea is one person at the beginning of the book. She's a completely different, she's almost a liberated woman by the end of the book. But that hasn't happened through some single epiphany. It's happened through a hard course of incremental alterations in her character through the complexities of her experience. Anyway, George Eliot, Marian Evans, was married to an extraordinary man named George Lewis, G.H. Lewis. They were never married, Josh. It's a great thing because they couldn't get married because he had been married previously. And they braved, again, that whole Victorian world and said, we're married, Mr. and Mrs. Lewis. And we don't care if there's a ceremony or not. And Lewis interested me as much, talking about the liberalism of process, as I called it, because Lewis was this extraordinary guy, an actor, a producer, true, you can imagine how fond I am of him. He was a polymath journalist, a leading polymath journalist of his time. And he more than retire, but he withdrew a bit from the world in order to support her. He recognized her genius. And then he devoted himself, among other things, to helping build the London sewer. What could be a more rhinoceros-like, truly, in every sense, mud and crap enterprise than devoting yourself to the London sewer? But of course, that effort of public works to build the London sewer saved. There's a great book about it. You may have read about the Great Stink, it's called, because every summer the Thames would fill up with raw sewage and stink, and people would scratch their heads and say, wonder if this has anything to do with all the cholera that people are dying from around here. They build the sewer, they clean it up, and it saves tens, hundreds of thousands of lives, by extension, by example, millions of lives. That, for me, is a triumph of the liberal vision. That's a moral adventure of liberalism. That idea that that idea, again, not a glamorous idea, the idea investing in essential public works, that can do more good for human happiness than any utopian vision. That, for me, is core to liberalism, and it's produced by George Eliot's husband. So that's what I mean by the moral adventure. And I was sort of leading with my chin a bit, pugnaciously, saying, you think that the radicals are glorious, and they are. I spent a great deal of time in the book about Emma Goldman, who's one of the people I most like in the world, wildly anti-liberal, radical leftist, libertarian of another kind. So it's not that I think liberalism has a monopoly on moral adventure, but I think liberalism can only be understood as a moral adventure, not as a dry, deadly, legalistic, individualistic, atomizing school of thought.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up question to that. The adventure is often, or it features a protagonist, often a younger protagonist, confronting natural or human-created disasters that compel themes or ordeals, trials and survival, which taken together build strength and resilience. For that reason, adventure stories are often a compelling genre for younger readers. And your imagined reader of your daughter, Olivia, who I believe was a teenager at the time when the story was composed.
She was 17. She's now 21. I spoke to her just this morning. I was tweeting just last night. I wrote a somewhat anthologized piece about her imaginary friend when she was 3, which the New Yorker just posted on its website. And I was saying, she has now become my imaginary friend, because I think about her all the time and rarely get to see her. She's up at college in Boston. And she, and I wanted it for her as that sense that there's an adventure here. This is not something you can condescend to. Fascinatingly, Josh, or fascinating for me in any case, I started writing the book, the night I began talking to her, she was somewhat to my left, and she's now zipped all the way over to my right.
Yeah.
And she's become not a conservative. Her mother would be unhappy if I said that, but she's certainly become, she lives in an American university environment where she's on, they're shut down this year, but still engaged, in which all of the pieties are progressive, right? Where there are things you can say and things you can't say. And I'm very proud that she was raised in a household where there was enough argument, and the most beautiful words you could say at dinner was, let me push back on that a little, So if when I said something, and the kids would say, Dad, let me push back on that a little. That's a beautiful phrase, right? It means you think for yourself. Anyway, so she's now somewhat over my right.
Has she changed that way since the publication of the book and since the election that just took place now? Has that been something that's changed?
Well, she was extremely shrewd. I think she's has a good, realistic mind. She works for a conservative consulting group, some part-time, so she was exposed to other views. She was very clear. She told me, what I didn't want to hear on Monday night, which said, Dad, this is going to be a very close election. Trump, you have to respect that this is going to be a very close election. It was actually quite funny, Josh, because I was, as you can imagine, like everyone of my political persuasion, tens of millions of people around the world, hundreds of millions. And I say of my political persuasion, but let me cancel, let me push back against my own remark. Not of my political persuasion, of my values. It has nothing to do with politics in the sense of where you stand on national health care, I'm for it. Where you stand on higher taxes on the rich, I'm for them. But you could certainly be a skeptic of nationalized medicine and a skeptic of higher tax rates and still recognize that Donald Trump is a uniquely vile human being leading a vile movement. And as you know, many honorable conservatives and ex-Republicans in America felt that way. Anyway, Olivia assured me on Monday night that it was going to be close. And then Tuesday night, of course, was the beginning of an awful roller coaster, and went to sleep on Tuesday night full of dread, thinking, you know what, this was not the dreadful part, but thinking maybe it's time to go home to Canada. And then at 5 o'clock in the morning, my son, who's 5 years older than her, and he was an analytic philosopher, getting his PhD in analytic philosophy. Wow. So he has the kind of mind that instead of seeing emotionally, as I tend to, sees very specifically. He called me at 5 in the morning and said, Biden won, Dad. I said, what are you talking about? It was a nightmare last night. He said, no, he won. He'll win Wisconsin in 2 hours. He'll win Michigan in 6. He'll win Pennsylvania sometime Friday or Saturday, and he'll probably win Georgia too, though that'll be closer. Boom.
So they knew that you have the philosophy of insomnia, as you describe it in the book, where 3 a.m. is that witching hour where you're worried.
Yes, exactly. And they reach out, as I call it, I get my pity call every day from both of them, when they have moments, better give Dad a pity call. Yes, I use that expression. It's nice that you picked it out, that all of us have, our true philosophy is the philosophy of our insomnia. Yeah. What we say at 3 p.m. is sort of meaningless. What we worry about at 3 a.m. is profound. What we wake up and can't get back to sleep because worrying about it is the real thing. And for me, for the last 4 years and continuing out, nothing got resolved, just something got altered the other night. My fear is that liberal cities, as I like to call them, not reserving it to cities, but the particular liberal institutions, maybe a better way of putting it. It is a better way of putting it. The liberal institutions which have grown up incrementally with enormous difficulty, but with extraordinarily powerful and positive results over the past 200 years, that they are threatened, mortally threatened. We've seen them die in Russia, where they hardly ever came to life. We've seen them under assault in Hungary, where, Canada's own Michael Ignatieff had to fight the good fight for a university, an open university, and withdrew. We've seen them dying all around the world. And to think that those liberal institutions would fail in the United States, which for all of its inequities and for all of the obscenities of its history, nonetheless is a place that had the DNA of liberal democracy in it, to think that it would fail there, that was the philosophy of my insomnia.
Yeah, absolutely. It strikes me that other parents, probably when you were talking about this book or when it originally came out and you were talking to people, did you have other parents that would come up and share a kindred thought that your book written to your daughter to try and find some commiseration and some solace in what is a troubled time? Did people respond to that that nudge that you had?
Oh yeah, the book sort of had its first sort of minimal appearance the day after the election, because a lot of people had said to me, what are you going to say to your kids? Can you write something? So I wrote something and posted it on I didn't post it. It was published on the New Yorker website. And that was sort of the beginning. People's response to that made me think that they wanted more. In the best possible way, one of the pleasures of writing this book was sharing it with people who didn't agree with me. And now, obviously, it's read by people who don't agree with you. They're called reviewers, and they're a lesser breed. I am one myself. There's nothing in the world that is as beautifully ironic as that those of us who make our living my little brother is like this. My little brother Blake was the art critic at the Globe and Mail for many years, and he was a killer critic. I'm more a kind of pat you on the head and then write the book you should have written kind of guy. He was a killer critic. And then he's just written this big, beautiful book about Andy Warhol. And when he gets an unfair review, he's extremely indignant, right? Like, how could they say such things? But one of the things I wanted to do is I shared the ideas with my kids' contemporaries. And it was hugely helpful, right? Because on things like critical race theory and so on, not only did they point me to texts that I needed to read that were second nature to them and not to me, because I come from another generation, but then they also pushed back in ways that were striking and practical. And as you know, and it's the single thing that if an author is allowed a bit of pride, the single thing I'm proudest of in this book is that I set out to write the counter arguments, the attacks on liberalism from the left and the right, not only as honestly as I could, but as passionately as I could. In other words, so that the attack would be super credible in that sense. And one of the things I did was to draw on my kids' generation, their friends, and to focus, to help me focus. You know, what were they saying? What made them indignant, especially on my kids' generation on the left, but also in the chapter on why the right hates liberalism. I tried, and I like to think I succeeded. I think I did, actually, in drawing on not on the Trumpites, who Trump's name appears only twice in the entire book, but on the truly great conservative philosophers, Michael Oakeshott and Canada's own Charles Taylor, who's maybe the greatest conservative philosopher alive, and who was a McGillite colleague of my parents when they were at McGill. And that's the real challenge, right? It's not hard to out-argue Steve Bannon or Stephen Miller, but finding an answer to Charles Taylor's great objection. You remember Charles Taylor's objection to the liberal ideal is he said, liberals want us to see ourselves in terms of what I want. It's an inherently acquisitive philosophy, acquisitive materially, but also acquisitive psychologically. We're always asking, what do I want? And the great conservative question, the real human question is, where am I? How am I related horizontally to other people, to people of my faith, to my family? And that liberalism has amputated that question of where am I and turned it into perpetually asking, what do I want? And that's the reason for our terribly empty and anxious society. That's not a trivial objection. That's a profound objection. And trying to address it, I hope, enrich the book.
And it's a social context that you didn't make and you can't control. And staying with that, what would be, and indulge that, I think the way that you describe that the right attacks on liberalism is the reliance on reason, or the over-reliance on reason. How does the liberal response address that critique from the right?
Well, Josh, it's fascinating you say that, because as you say it, I suddenly, and thinking about Charles Taylor as well, of course, because I think about Quebec. I grew up in Quebec. Quebec is
two Montrealers.
Montreal is my hometown. It's still, the place eventually we'll go back to. We'll buy a little apartment in the old city and skate out on the dock. It's people always, whenever I come back to Canada, either virtually as tonight or in reality, think that I make a great deal of the Montreal Canadiens, of the Habs, in all my writing, and they always act as though it must be kind of affectation. I'm not really serious about that, but I am serious about it. I live and die with the Habs. I was on Montreal radio a while ago, and they were sort of there-thering me about it, right? And I immediately launched into all the things I would do if I were the general manager of the Canadiens, and they kind of were like, "You really?" Anyway, so Quebec. So Quebec presents that issue for us, right? Because Quebec is simultaneously a liberal state, a liberal province, and a liberal nation, but it's also a country, a little country, that draws its identity from a common history, from a common language, from a commonality that is not rational. In other words, it isn't something where you can say, oh, you'll do better in confederation than you'll do off by yourself. It isn't a question of utility. It isn't a question of economics, where we'll do better. It's a question of how we feel inside. We feel connected to our history. We feel connected to our fellow Francophones. We feel connected to Quebecers. It need not be exclusivist, though too often it is, but it can theoretically be welcoming of immigrants who choose to assimilate into the French milieu. But certainly one of the things that I grew up with every day was the sense that we don't want a cosmopolitan city. We don't want Montreal, which is a wonderfully cosmopolitan city, not to recognize the predominance of the French fact in it. That's not a rational claim. That's a perfect example of a question of values rather than interests guiding people. And yet, all right, so that's the reality, and anybody who tries to wish it away is blind. The positive side of that story is that liberal politics, democratic politics, enabled Quebecers and Canadians over a long period of very difficult and complicated history to find a solution, to forge a compromise like the Mills that, for the moment, knock wood, seems to work. And I'm always struck by it every time I'm back home in Montreal. When I was a kid growing up, the politics of language were very melodramatic. Which language you chose to address a storekeeper or someone in was significant. French or English, obviously. Now, because of an increased security, because of all the changes that have taken place in Montreal and Quebec, if I start in French, which I still do, almost universally Francophones will switch into English, hearing my Canadian Anglophone accent, because they no longer feel that they have to over-assert themselves in order to make it plain that this is our place. Through, one of my heroes, one of the most improbable heroes, because he's not a name most people conjure with, is Jean Chrétien. I don't think Jean Chrétien was a kind of placeholder or a plumber. I think he was a great politician. He was one of the people who, through the dogged rhinoceros-like work of adjustment and talk about a rhinoceros politician, right? We all made fun of him, his way of talking and all of that, but he did enormous good in forging a series of compromises that, again, knock wood, really seem to have stuck, and have made the threat of the end of Confederation, which I grew up with, which I even you, being younger, grew up with, have made it increasingly remote. That's how we both address the reality of those passionate communitarian feelings, if you like, passionate feelings of identity, which can't be wished away or reasoned away, can never be reasoned away, and at the same time are able to place them within a framework of reasoning, of persuasion, rational argument, that allows them both to be expressed and to be sufficiently limited that they don't lead to violence and civil war.
And that addresses the Scylla of the right. Now we have the Charybdis of the left-leaning critique. And from the left, as you write, the critique is chiefly one related to the question of reform. How can liberals respond to the critique that reform's pace of change isn't radical enough or revolutionary enough, and that it has a tendency of exporting its horrors to more vulnerable places in the world? How does the liberal position address those concerns?
Yes, exactly. What's thematic in the book is that the right-wing attack on liberalism is essentially an attack on the fetishization of reason, and the left-wing attack, exactly as you say, is an attack on the naive and fatuous, and in many ways deliberately misleading belief in reform. What I try and do in the book, and I give the example because it came right to me, that my son Luke came to me when I was in the middle of writing a piece. I know I over-reference my kids, but I do it partly out of parental pride, but also because one of the principles of liberalism is to deal with the particulars, not the abstractions whenever you can. So particularly, I was writing still one more piece about the Nazi Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust in Europe, a review of a book by Timothy Snyder. And Luke, my son, came to me and said, "Dad, you've written I don't know how many pieces about the Jewish Holocaust. You've never written a piece about the Congo Holocaust. The horrible, catastrophic mass murder of Congolese rubber workers by the Belgians under King Leopold. And I was stricken. He was right. He had been doing his reading as a young leftist. And he said, this is something that's missing from your imagination. And it's something that directly implicates the 19th century European society that you, on the whole, admire and so on. And that was true. And our response, I think the right liberal response to that is not to deny it any more than in Canada we deny the harm done to the First Nations people or, the long history of injustice. It's to confront it. And liberalism, every ideology has to have its corrective conscience. And more than any ideology or philosophy or governing principle that I can think of, or that has ever existed, liberalism puts the corrective conscience at its heart. It's why when I was touring Canada last year, before the sky fell in, with this book, everywhere I went, of course, to my surprise, because I hadn't been aware of it, I was asked to read the statement of land rights. Saying we're on land, unceded land. I can't think what the generic name for that piece of paper is.
Land acknowledgement.
Land acknowledgement. Yeah, exactly. And at each place, I would be coached on the proper pronunciation of the Aboriginal name, that we're on unceded land of the Kwakiutl people or something. Yep. Now, it has a slightly comic element in as much as it's a piece of paper you're handed, and how deep the roots go we can argue about. But it's quite profound because it's the liberal corrective conscience at work. It's a way of saying this is a failure of ours, which to the degree that we can, we have to remedy. Against that, you have a leftist tradition of revolutionary change, which has a very hard time instantiating a corrective conscience in itself, which has a very bad record of being able to confront. Again, we'll look at a particular. My wife and I just watched that extraordinary, dramatic but documentary in Foundation series Chernobyl. I don't know if you saw it. Absolutely. It was an HBO. Probably the best single thing I've ever seen on television. And brilliantly done. And what was it about? That was exactly what it was about. Pictures of Lenin are everywhere and of the brave workers, and there's a rhetoric of revolutionary equality. And yet, there is truly, to assert the corrective conscience requires an act of heroism, an act of self-annihilating heroism, because the whole system is built to repress the truth, so that critical feedback can never happen, because if you criticize the organization of the nuclear power plant, you are attacking the sanctity of the Communist Party. That's what it illustrates. And the end result was the greatest nuclear catastrophe, and in some respects, the end of the Soviet Union. And that's something, and I always, and in the leftist response to my book and in general, no one has anything more than a rhetorical answer to that, to be perfectly blunt. In other words, you say, here you have a history in which you do have radical change, you do have revolutionary change, and not only does it always end up badly, but it always ends up horribly in a intellectually corrupt way, where you end up repressing truth indefinitely. And, I have many friends who are to my left. It's bound to, wherever you plant your flag, you're going to have someone to your right and someone to your left. Yeah. They have people well to their left as well. And the insistence, very often, very indignantly, is, but no, there's absolutely no contradiction between civil liberties and revolutionary change. That's an assertion. No one has yet demonstrated how you can have the two at the same time, because it's built into the nature of revolutionary change, of radical change, that dissent is going to have to be suppressed. Because if you respect dissent, then that means respecting opposition parties and opposition points of view. That means that your radicalism is always going to be curbed by opposition. Wonderful and extraordinary radical change can take place. One of my other heroes, who makes a brief but not sufficient appearance in the book, is Tommy Douglas. When I was growing up, Tommy Douglas was the most admired Canadian, right? Brings Medicare to Canada, spreads the gospel of it. But Tommy Douglas worked, like Clement Attlee in Britain, gloriously within the context of parliamentary politics, which means dealing with the social credit folks, and it means dealing with the conservatives, and it means that your vision, your radical vision, is constantly going to have to be curbed and corrected. And that's why we have a great social democratic tradition in Canada. We have a great social democratic tradition in Europe. Unfortunately, we don't have as great a social democratic tradition in America, and it's something that I hope that my kids' generation has taken on as a blazon and purpose. But that fundamental reality that the reason we believe in reform rather than revolution, liberals believe, is not because we like things to happen slowly. Look, the two issues I'm most passionate about at a practical political level are incarceration. I have a long piece in the New Yorker this week about incarceration, in which the phrase lived experience actually comes up again and again. It's a hugely important one.
As does a Thousand Small Sanities was a previous piece
Previous,
on.
yes, exactly so, exactly so. Came out of writing on incarceration. And the other thing I feel passionately about, of course, is gun control, gun sanity in America. I have no desire for incremental change in the gun laws in the United States. If I were king of the forest, like the Cowardly Lion, I would bring Canadian gun laws to America tomorrow, or better still, Australian gun laws to America tomorrow. And America would be an infinitely better place if that happened. It's safer, more prosperous. And may I add too, because not enough people point this out, we talk about Black Lives Matter and the gunning down of black men and youths by police. Gun control is central to that problem, because if you talk to cops, which we all ought to do, the thing they tell you is that they're scared. Right? Because everybody in America has a gun, right? So you do a traffic stop or something of that kind, and they're frightened, right? Because they think that they overreact as a consequence. Not to forgive their overreaction, but I just mean having a heavily armed country creates paranoia on all sides. I'm not going to get the Canadian gun control in America tomorrow, not because Americans are evil and not because I'm a liberal incrementalist who doesn't want it. It's because there's deeply rooted and deeply passionate people on the other side for whom a gun is a symbol of individual liberty, and they will make the deal of killing a bunch of children in order to sustain that symbol. I think that's a grotesque and tragic error, but it's not one that I can alter by fiat. I'm going to have to work over the last 10 years, over the next 20 or 30 years, if I have the chance, to make that change happen. Incrementalism is not a reflection of a timid temperament. It's a reflection of the desire to be a radical of the real, a radical who makes real change happen.
And I find it fascinating when I was reading the book that the almost a dialectic that you're finding a way through is the rhinoceros conversation, while still paying some attention to the unicorn, to the position of the radical thought. But the figure that does really resonate in here is Frederick Douglass, who you call perhaps the greatest of all Americans. And you describe him as a radical prophet and a liberal prophet, or a liberal politician, almost as though he's able to exist in almost a vibration between the unicorn and the rhinoceros. What is it about Frederick Douglass that makes him such a unique figure in your book?
Well, I'm glad, Josh, you caught that I was positioning him as a remarkable figure who sits within two traditions, because some people would say, oh, you're trying to claim Douglass as a liberal, and I'm not, and that's not what I say in the book at all. Douglass has this extraordinary life. He starts as a slave, gets self-educated, physically struggles for his own freedom, and with a degree of courage that's hard for us to capture now, comes north, becomes the leader of the abolitionist movement, and then makes a vital decision. It's in his probably the greatest of all American speeches, his 5th of July speech in the 1850s, where he starts off attacking the American Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as a fraud, very much in the spirit of the 1619 project, as a fraud and a lie put about by white people to cover up their own slave ownings. And then he makes the most momentous U-turn in the history of rhetoric. He says, but there's nothing wrong with the Declaration. There's nothing wrong with the principles of the Constitution. Those are good principles. They just have to be expanded to include everyone. They exclude me now, but if they included me, and they can include me, they would vindicate themselves. And he becomes, he has a choice to make. Go with John Brown to Harper's Ferry and that violent solution, or go with Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party towards another kind of violent solution, but one that's constitutional and organized. He chooses Lincoln. They have an incredibly thorny and unhappy and finally very benevolent relationship. So Douglas, for me, embodies both the hugely admirable unicorn heroic spirit of the radical prophet, the man who will not accept a compromise, who says, no, 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 graduated abolition is no good to us. We need instant emancipation. Our people, black people, must be free. Brooks, no compromise, but at the same time is a working, in those days, hard as this believe, Republican Party politician. And after the war, he remains with that identity. He remains a politician within the Republican Party, a man of immense literary gifts, has a very complicated life with lovers and European ones, one actually. So I love Frederick Douglass exactly because he reminds us that that struggle between the radical prophet and the democratic politician can be lived within one breast, within one body. It's not. It's like anything else that's of value in the world. It's built on its tensions, not out of an over-easy resolution.
Absolutely. And it's that cracked position that you trace the history of all the way back to Montaigne, I believe.
Exactly. Yeah, Montaigne. I'd make Montaigne rather than Montesquieu or Locke, the Moses of liberalism. Yes. Exactly because though he doesn't write really at all about how you ought to run a parliament or how you ought to, divide, whether you should have a bicameral legislature or a unicameral legislature. He makes the fundamental claim, fundamental discovery, if you like, human discovery, that we are all double in ourselves. The things we believe, we deny. The things we deny, we secretly believe. That the double nature of humanity is what it is to be alive. It's, the only thing I can think of to compare Montaigne's transformative vision to is Freud. And whether Freud is right or not, I don't know. In the sense that, you read Shakespeare, when he clearly reads Montaigne sometime in the 1590s, and everything alters for him. Hamlet comes pouring out because he suddenly says, it's not good or bad people, it's people who are divided. To be or not to be is the fundamental question. Ambivalence is the human condition. So yes, I make Montaigne exactly because he recognizes the inescapable nature of human fallibility, and not just fallibility, that we're all flawed, but of human doubleness, that we live two lives at once, an internal life, an external life, two external lives, like the Mills, that you live a life of primal virtue on the page and of, compromised concupiscence, I can't even pronounce the word, on the rhinoceros's bench.
Absolutely. And, I was so struck by how shrewdly you chose every one of the heroes and heroines that make an appearance in this book. And it struck me, I wondered whether there were other heroes or heroines that almost made it in, but just couldn't fit, that make a story in this.
Absolutely. That's a terrific observation. There were. And I had to draw, some of them were too obscure. Tommy Douglas, for instance, right? It's just explaining the prairie politics of the 1930s in Canada is not. It's a very short book, and so I had to make it's a kind of pointillist thing.
Yeah.
The real thing that's missing, though, Josh, are the French, and it's funny that people haven't noted it more because it's a real hole in the center of the book, and particularly strange coming from an ostentatiously public Francophile like myself. Yeah. And in the original draft of the book, I had Montaigne is the only one who remains. I had Camus, for instance, Albert Camus.
He makes a very brief appearance. Yeah.
Very brief, but that's the vestige of a much longer section on Camus. Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël, who were going to be my French version of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor. I had a whole thing worked out about them, and cut it from the book. And someday, it's like the basement tapes, right? If anybody wants to do, what do they call that in rock and roll? I don't call it the expanded edition. The bootleg, the deluxe edition. You get all the takes of Exiles on Main Street added to the thing. There's a long French section of the book that I cut for two reasons. One, because it just made the book too long, and the names and ideas had to be sort of translated, not just literally from the French, but intellectually. Liberalism in France means something very different than it means here. It's something much more like free market conservatism. So there was a lot of that work to do. And also, this may have been a misjudgment of my own, probably was. I thought I don't know how to put this without sounding, well, it is egocentric. I'm sort of associated with French ideas and French things, and I didn't want that to seem like a kind of a patisserie, a kind of an ornamental surface laid out over it. That it would seem, particularly as most of those names and figures were not as well known. I don't know. That was a decision I made, but you're very right that there are people missing. And as I say, there's many, but above all, it's the French tradition that I miss when I look at the book now and reproach myself a little bit for not having included.
Well, I'm a 19th century scholar, so there's lots for me to chew on while I was reading. I'm going to make a little bit of a shift and talk about some of the more contemporary questions. But as I'm doing that, if people have questions that you'd like to ask Adam, and cogitations, thoughts, whatever, you could enter them into the Q&A, and I'll try and bring you in as we go along. So a question that I have, throughout the book, you make the persuasive case for the central role of institutions. And here by institutions, you mean far more than parliaments and governing bodies, but also public schools, libraries, service groups, and so forth. Institutions that are integral to our cumulative understanding of liberalism and to the ties of sociability that make up the public sphere or social capital. In recent years, and certainly in the last 4 years, liberal institutions have come under a considerable assault. Many of these institutions, which represent the best of ourselves, created over time through those evolving forms, as you've described, have been put under such enormous stress. And institutions that you wouldn't think that would be under stress, like the Department of Justice, the Center for Disease Control, which has been a world source of information on health. The US postal system has been put under enormous stress because of the relationship to the elections. A big picture question for you: are these institutions resilient enough to withstand the assault that they've incurred, or have they incurred a damage that's going to take us years to resolve?
I don't know is the honest answer. It concerns me enormously, as you can imagine. The CDC is a perfect example of it. There was an institution that was largely above the fray, because who's in favor of infectious disease?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that in the Trump era, there are people who are actually in favor of infectious disease, who would rather you not wear a mask in order to declare your loyalty to Trump. And if you get sick, bad luck for you. And they had those monstrous super spreader parties, in the White House and so on. Look, as we speak tonight, I'm in a better mood than I was a week ago, literally, last Tuesday night. I believe, and you'll pardon my saying so, that many of the key principles of this book were vindicated the other night. Joe Biden is a rhinoceros politician. The coalition that was put together for the narrow but essential purpose of ejecting Donald Trump from office, stretched, as I say, from those ex-Republicans of the Lincoln Project all the way to leftists. The single most striking thing, Josh, I want to address your question, but just because not enough people have pointed it out. It's like the dog, the strange incident of the dog in the nighttime in Sherlock Holmes, right? What was the strange incident? The dog did nothing in the nighttime. That was the strange incident. The strange incident in this campaign was the silence of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, even as Joe Biden was saying, I've defeated the socialists. I'm no socialist, right? Bernie Sanders, as he would have done in Hillary time, instead of saying, hey, I'm a socialist and there's nothing wrong with socialism, was completely silent, because he understood, he had respected Biden, and he understood the exigencies of the campaign. That was an astonishing act, and it was a credit to Biden's benevolence as a person. Clearly, Bernie has enormous affection and respect for him. I feel that in so many of those principles, right, were vindicated. The principle of coalition building, principle of compromise, the principle that the heroic figure may not look heroic, all of those things. But even as we speak tonight, those institutions are still under assault. Donald Trump is firing, despite being defeated, firing people in the Pentagon with very ominous overtones and replacing them with his loyalists. I don't know that those institutions, in other words, have passed their immediate stress test. And then going forward, once people talk about violating norms a lot, Josh. Trump violates norms. And that makes it sound as though he's like the Rodney Dangerfield character in Caddyshack. Do you remember that movie? He comes in and he's kind of, shouting and farting, and there's something sort of almost invigorating about his violation of norms. Trump doesn't violate norms. Trump violates premises. And the difference is that a premise is something that you don't stop to think would be under assault because you can't have a social life without it, right? It's like saying, it's like saying, nowhere on the box of Monopoly, in the rules of Monopoly, does it say you cannot use a machine gun to force the banker to give you boardwalk. Because if you're going to bring a machine gun to Monopoly, the game is over. You can't do it. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say the losing candidate must accept his loss, because you realize you can't have the game, you can't have the premise of democracy if you don't accept that. So Trump isn't violating norms. He's assaulting premises. And the degree to which those premises can survive what Trump has done and what the Republican Party is doing even now is unsure. It's a lot better when that man, pray that it happens, is expelled. And just to add one thing, the other side in which I feel that some of the principles of this book were vindicated is I recognize that it's not enough. It's not enough. My side, the progressive side, lost as much as it won. Yeah. But it won the one essential thing. And one of the parts of the maturity of social thought is recognizing that you can work with people of wildly different kinds to achieve the one essential thing. That was the history of the resistance in France in the 40s. During the war. People forget that it involved Gaullists working with communists to fight Nazis. That's a good model.
And you're absolutely right in terms of the vindication, because in the book you describe the rhinoceros position as being one of compromise. And as you say, with Bernie Sanders staying quiet and the coalitions that mobilized behind Joe Biden, that was an act of compromise to save liberal institutions.
Yes, exactly. Bernie Sanders bit his lip and was silent in a completely admirable, and it was the heroism of silence. And he was saying, I have to save this institution. We have to save the democratic system. And then we'll have an argument about Medicare for all. And I thought that was genuinely, my opinion of Bernie Sanders has gone up so much because the courage of silence was quite extraordinary in his ability to understand what his role was in that coalition.
I think a lot of us over the last 4 years have found ourselves asking, how could a country like the United States, built on the belief in the importance of liberal institutions and regarded around the world for its long tradition of liberal education, how could a country like this so flagrantly disregard its high purpose and liberal values? And yet, as you've remarked in the book, this is not a special feature of one era or another. Strongman politics and boss man rule in simplest form is the story of mankind. So that direct assault on democracy and rule of law is more the norm in the historical. If you were to focus on one institution, because there's so many that we could think about of whether we'll need remedial action, what institution, what liberal institution or tradition should be at the front of mind in the post-Trump era?
Well, let's talk about the one that I'm most, familiar with, that I take part in, and that's the media. That's journalism and the press and so on. And clearly, we're living through a time of enormous crisis, because every institution that I grew up taking for granted, daily newspapers, for instance, television news and all that, have been fragmented. Now, in some ways, they've been fragmented in a way that democratizes them. In other ways, they've been fragmented in ways that alienates them, not just from each other, but from any common idea of truth. That's something that people raise all the time. So, having a changing model of journalism in the United States, which is already moving from, profit-seeking independence to essentially a philanthropic model. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, not because he ever expects to make a buck from it. He makes his bucks from owning the world and delivering packages, but because he thinks it's an important philanthropic function, just as, 100 years ago, John D. Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan thought it was an important philanthropic function to start a museum. Jeff Bezos thinks it's an important philanthropic function to support a newspaper. How viable a model that is, rich guys supporting a free press, is unclear. And where it ends, because Mark Zuckerberg is one of those rich guys, is uncertain. But that's one of the institutions that's most under assault. I had a chance last summer to work with a group who were trying, where the real, in Canada and the United States, where the real crisis is being felt is at the local level. One local paper after another is being annihilated.
Absolutely.
And there's a movement, a foundation afoot, whose purpose is to seed and support local newspapers everywhere. And I got involved with one in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and was able to, funnel them some interns and goodwill and work. If 1,000 Small Sanities, 1,000 Small Presses is essential to the workings of democracy. Now, we have 1,000 small presses in as much as my computer and your computer both function as printing presses now, and that's a huge change. But linking that up, it's happening. The problem is, of course, that the utopian hopes of social media have all been horribly dashed, right? But I think that that's a place where we're going to go. I'm not giving you a good answer, but I'm pointing to what I think of as an enormous problem. The other thing I'd say, if I can add, is education, right? Yeah. It's a cliche, but it's a cliche because of the profound depth of its truth. Education cures most things. There's been one study after another that shows that if you want to reduce income inequality, which is a plague in the United States, the single best thing you can do is pre-K education. That's the single best, most robust correlation. Get kids in school before kindergarten, and you'll begin to see social inequality diminish. And the commitment to public education, I think, is something that Canada, I think, on the whole, does much better, and the commitment to affordable college and all of and those things. I used to say, as someone who, to his shame, sent his kids to a private school in New York, that the single best reform that New York could have was to abolish all private schools. Because the moment you abolished all private schools, the cadre of affluent people in New York would have to focus their attention on public schools, and you'd have a revolution in the public schools afterwards. It's not a realistic plan, but I do think that there is nothing that matters as much as public education to the health of a liberal democracy.
Brilliant. I'm going to grab a question here from the chat. In your view, how can those who support your vision of liberalism best address or combat anti-intellectualism?
Well, public education, also by being unapologetic about intellect. It was one place where I did not long ago, the Lafayette Baldwin lecture I did last year. And this year at Kerner Hall, it was an amazing Canadian event. Only in Canada would you be able to bring that many people together for a tedious highbrow lecture. And we did a kind of reunion of the Lafayette Baldwin lecturers this last time, and Michael Sandel was there talking about his book on the danger of the elites, right? That the problem in the United States, it's in Canada too, is that we have an overeducated elite who condescend to common people, and that creates the reaction, and that's the problem. I see it, frankly, I admire Michael very much, but I see it in just the opposite terms. I think that that's kind of the moral template of anti-Semitism. In other words, that there are people who are highly educated, and resentment of them becomes an acceptable emotion. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's extremely dangerous. And I think that not only should educated people be unashamed of their education, but they should do everything in their power to see to it that it can be shared by as many people as possible. Look, I am doubtless an overeducated guy, right? Although, in fact, I'm the only member of my family of 6 children who does not have a PhD. That's what we call a Jewish dropout. But my parents, not to be sentimental about it, but to be truthful about it, were their parents were immigrants, fresh off the boat. And because there was an effective system of public education, fellowships, and affordable colleges, they ended up as university professors. That model happens. That model works. It's a model we should emulate, admire, make much of, and not apologize for at any time. There's nothing better than education, and nothing more admirable than intellect. Now, you can say, well, you say that because you can't play hockey or do any of the other things that are even more admirable. But I think I would feel that way even if I didn't benefit from it.
Absolutely. Another question from the chat. I'm picking this question because there's also another great Montreal connection here. What does Kamala Harris and her multiracial background bring to the White House in the context of a greater degree of liberalism in the United States?
Well, Kamala Harris went to Westmount High with many of my brothers and sisters.
Ah, wow.
They're close, but they're all Westmount Highers, and they just kind of overlap. They didn't know her, but they recognized her. Curious thing that they say, and I believe this to be true, she wasn't thought of as black in the context of Westmount High. She was thought of as Indian, right? That was much more as East Asian. She was obviously exotic. Look, I think it's fantastic, obviously. I mean, in one fell swoop, you have the first woman and the first African American, first minority, and clearly somebody who's, and married to a Jewish guy. That's the first time that Jewish guy
first
gets
man
into the line of succession, but as naturally as the first gentleman. It's a wholly positive, good thing that we should be overjoyed about. The only thing I'd add to that, if I might, and this will be a somewhat obnoxious remark, or some will take it to be obnoxious, we run the risk of misunderstanding the arithmetic of the American electorate sometimes, because we're so enormously and properly proud of the emergence of diversity, of ethnic and racial minorities, not to mention women who form the majority, the human majority into it, that it is easy to overlook the reality that white people, so-called, remain by far the largest ethnic or identity group in America. And Biden's peculiar rhinoceros genius was to put together a coalition which would include Kamala Harris on the one hand, but would also include white suburban women and a significant number for the, once again, not the majority, but a significant number of white working class men and so on. I think it's a huge mistake in thinking about liberal politics to privilege any one point on that broad coalition. That the coalition works because it's a coalition, because it brings together very different kinds. And each one of those kinds is worth celebrating, and the more diverse the kinds become, the better it is. But it's a coalition. It's a coalition of many kinds.
Great. Another question here. It seems nowadays like political battle lines are being drawn between those who care about others and those who don't, and who refuse to be ashamed of it. To what extent has the erosion of empathy revealed liberalism's dependence on empathy, and the idea that even the most rationalist liberal arguments, on some level, presuppose empathy? To put it simply, how does democracy work if you can't compel people to care about others?
Well, what a great question, because as you know, Josh, I have a whole section about sympathy, right?
You do.
But the crucial liberal idea, in addition to the failibism and the acceptance of our own double natures, crucial liberal idea is the idea, Adam Smith and David Hume, pedantic footnote, bring it forward in the 18th century in England, of human sympathy. That it's not the Hobbesian idea that we're at perpetual war, but that it's normal for human beings to feel, we're social animals, to feel a spark of sympathy for their fellow human beings, and that the great end of a liberal society is to take that spark of sympathy, which we naturally give to people of our clan or creed or kind, and extend it to citizenship. Take the spark of sympathy from the clan, extend it to some idea of citizenship. And empathy is another way of stating the same thing. So it's absolutely true that that's the foundational emotion of a liberal society. And it is also absolutely true that when we're talking about Trump and Trumpism, even more than being offended at this choice of a judge or the cruelty at the border, it's the absolute psychopathic absence of compassion as a governing emotion that's most frightening about Trump as a figure and about Trumpism as an emotion. As somebody said once, the cruelty is the point. The cruelty isn't the thing that they're ashamed of. The cruelty is the point. And the way in which Trump, like every authoritarian figure, gives his followers license for cruelty, tells them that the work of compassion and sympathy is ignoble and effeminate and is part of the evil, and I use that word advisedly, that Trump does. The only thing I'd say about that is, and I think it's a crucial lesson, is Trump lost. He lost the popular vote 4 years ago. He lost by what looks likely to be now 6 million votes. America has not embraced Trump. America never embraced Trump. America rejected Trump. He still has a following of tens of millions of people, and it would be naive and foolish to overlook that. But we mustn't give it undue weight either. Authoritarian figures come to power, they seize power, they remain in power ruthlessly, but they very rarely genuinely command the sympathy, crucial word, of the majority of their country people.
Brilliant. This is a good Rhino question. What is the likelihood of compromise between the two parties in the foreseeable future?
You know, I am, and I say this not to be evasive, but just to be honest, I'm not a political pundit. I know that sounds hard to believe given all my opinions, but I don't pretend to be. I write about values and experiences, about people and their predicaments, and I don't pretend to, to give counsel platforms to politicians. I certainly, and it'll be one of the fascinating things that works out in the next few years, Joe Biden is a model of a compromiser. He believes, and I think he sincerely believes it, that he can come to an understanding with the people in the Republicans in Congress that has eluded Barack Obama and many others. That's his craft, and we will see. I'm extremely skeptical of it. The only thing I'd add to that, though, is that with all of the enormous and real and visible harm that's being done to those structures of compassion, to liberal institutions, we should also remember that to a remarkable degree they do continue to function. They function locally very often. They function narrowly. The pandemic has been a kind of X-ray of the flaws, the weaknesses of American society, its inequalities, and so on. When I was on the first night of the shutdown, I went out and I wrote about it for the New Yorker, and I saw a East Indian delivery man, food delivery man, on his bicycle, overloaded with food that he was going to be delivered. And my God, was that an image, right, of social inequality? The poor, overloaded delivery man, braving the virus to serve the more privileged people behind it. But it's also been an X-ray of the positive sides of this society. New York City went through, I cannot describe to you, Josh, the ambulances outside my window in March and April. Pray that they don't return. But New Yorkers endured, they masked up, they socially distanced, they stayed indoors, they did all of those things, as people are doing in Australia and Northern Italy and so on. I know I'm going over, but it's a terribly important piece of social research that's been overlooked, I think. The question, one of the key questions is social capital, which is just another name for the health of liberal institutions. Is it helpful in fighting something like this pandemic, right? Are places with greater degrees of social trust and stronger social capital doing better than places with poor social capital? Well, you only have to look at Canada and the United States to see that that's so. Canada, and I don't intend to idealize Canada unduly, but Canada is a country with very strong social capital, and the United States much weaker. But here's the fascinating thing, Josh. It isn't that countries or regions that have strong social capital do better. What happens is this, according to these studies in Northern Italy particularly. At first, we do much worse if you have strong social capital, like New York City, like the north of Italy, because you have habits of communality. People go places. People go to bars. People go to pubs. People go to tavernas. People go to trattorias. And then, when the crisis hits and the word comes that we have to behave differently, they respond much more quickly. The north of Italy responds much more quickly than the south of Italy, because the same habits of sociability that lead us to a higher infection rate are also the habits of social trust that make us trust a persuasive argument. They make us believe in the power of evidence and reason, and in doing our best. We wear a mask not for ourselves, but for the next guy, right? Or the next woman. So I find that a fascinating paradox of social capital. It'll get you in trouble early on, but it will save your city in the long run.
Yeah, and this links to a question I was going to ask, and it's maybe a good place to ask it. So the United States, like other developed countries right now, are experiencing an acute level of skyrocketing levels of inequality, where some people have felt entitled to sequester themselves in a world of privilege, resources, and security. For the first time in a long time, some of those privileged people who live comfortably and with security felt very scared and insecure. And that gave them an experience that matches or is at least close to the experience of billions of other people in the world. I'm wondering right now, with that experience, whether that sympathetic moment could potentially be an opportunity for a reevaluation. I'm not sure if you saw the article early in the pandemic, Arundhati Roy wrote about the pandemic as a portal, and that idea that there's a time divide between pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and post-pandemic are an opportunity to reorganize social life. Do you see the potential after COVID-19 or in the months ahead as an opportunity to maybe reevaluate some of those disturbances in that equality in the United States?
Really complicated question. It's funny you mentioned Arundhati Roy. We did a conversation about these issues together in Bologna, Italy, just a year ago. I pronounced Bologna, Italy in a sort of Trump-like way, didn't I? Bologna, Italy. But we did. And she, of course, is struggling with enormous heroism against, the Indian circumstance and Hindu nationalism, which she spoke about eloquently, which in some ways makes the Trumpism look Modi look trivial in the if you're an Indian Muslim. Nonetheless, complicated question to answer. I'm always skeptical of, it's sort of the Scrooge model of human change, right? You go through one bad night, you're awakened, and you come out a better person. It's a beautiful story, rarely happens that way. Yeah. I believe in George Eliot more than in Dickens, right? Real change takes place incrementally. One of the most, let me tell you, and generally speaking, huge transformational moments like pandemics rarely change the trajectory of societies that much. The last great pandemic in the United States, of course, was the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919. It's terribly difficult. And what it set off was not a moment of chastened social consciousness. What it set off was the Jazz Age, the biggest, longest party in American history that ended only with the Great Depression, of course. Generally speaking, when you look historically, when pandemics end, whatever the trajectory was that the society was on before is the trajectory it returns to. My favorite example of that is if you think about the Black Death in Italy, in Florence, in the latter part of the 14th century. It annihilates half the population. But when it's finally over, within 40 years, Florence has once again become the dynamic cockpit, the engine of European innovation in finance and above all in the arts. So, the model of repentance, of suffering and repentance, I don't know if it actually works very well for human societies. What I do think is true, and one of the things that was most shocking to me in the local, and again, I like the local in particular, experience of the pandemic in New York, is what I call the Boccaccio phenomenon, the number of wealthy people who fled the city for their houses in the Hamptons. I thought that was a horrible thing, and one of the things that most shocked, and I can't say it surprised me, but it still infuriates me. It didn't disappoint me, it infuriates me, was the failure of all of the people who have made truly billions of dollars out of the possibilities that New York offered them in the past 20 and 30 years to come through for New York afterwards. I would have thought that you'd have New York We Got Your Back committee put together by 5 billionaires to support restaurants that are suffering horribly, to support all the institutions of New York that are in such trouble. They could do it easily, and that never materialized. The degree in which that sector has cut itself off from those essential feelings of responsibility to the rest of the city, let alone to the rest of the country, I find infuriating and frightening as a social indicator. At the same time, I think that one of the things that's been positive about New York is, you may hear from Donald Trump that New York is boarded up and miserable and all of that. But I tell you, as someone who lives here and who goes out every day to bicycle around Central Park, New York has never been more communal. New York has never been more vital in the crucial ways. On Saturday, when Biden was declared president, I walked out with our dog expecting nothing and found a city celebrating as though a war had ended. And that sense of, we couldn't embrace each other because of the pandemic. That sense of common experience and common purpose, I've never seen as strong in New York. So people are double in nature, and cities are double in nature too, being made of people. And I think that's been part of the worst of New York, the wealthy jettisoning themselves from the society has been evident. But the best of New York, this commonality of kinds, has been evident too.
I really like this very succinct question. It reminds me of something you said just in advance of when we went live on the call, that the weather in New York has never been better, but it provoked a sense of worry for you. But the question is, are you hopeful?
I'm more hopeful tonight than I was a week ago. But that in itself gives you some idea of how labile hope must be if it can change from week to week and day to day. It's in its nature. Hope is that, the thing with feathers, right, that perches in the soul, as Emily said. Beautiful image, right, of the fragility of hope. I am in this sense. Liberal institutions have been tested again and again in the past several hundred years. And this is crucial. People sometimes talk, especially people both on the left and the right, liberalism is finished. Liberalism is over. Vladimir Putin said that. Liberal institutions, liberal democracies are finished and they're over. And that implies that there was a moment when liberal institutions were really deeply rooted and anchored and hugely successful and so on. And the reality is, the historical reality is that at no moment in modern history has anyone been saying anything except that liberal institutions and liberalism is an ideal, cosmopolitanism, humanism are on their way out. I'm old enough to remember the early 1960s when it was the commonplace to say, look, Soviet communism is so much better organized, so much more militant, so much has a consuming and passionate vision of the world. There's no way in the world that the decadent liberal countries of the West can compete with it. And in fact, exactly what was decadent in those liberal countries, their ability to generate new and surprising artistic forms, conquered the East. It was Frank Zappa and the Grateful Dead who ended up being the emissaries of freedom in ways no one could have predicted. And I'm old enough, as are you, to remember 9/11. I lived through 9/11. I was there watching. And I remember how in the years after 9/11, we were told exactly the same thing. Here's a challenge from militant Islam, a culture and a belief that burns with the fire of passionate ideology, and they're just going to cut like a knife through butter through, again, our weak, decadent, diffused society. And there again, those of us who held true to liberal values and who didn't panic or go to war in Iraq, opposed it, who said this is a grievous injury, but it's only an injury, and we have to respond to it that way and not overreact. We were proven right. We were proven right. And it's the single most striking thing. I said the single most striking silence in this last election was Bernie Sanders. But what's the single most striking absence? It's talking about terrorism. Talking about terrorism. Terrorism never came up, not for a second, at any point. At any point, right? And 15 years ago, it was all that you were allowed to talk about was terrorism. But what happened, right? Did we actually go and defeat terrorism? No, of course not. We evolved the right kind of antibodies, and above all, we recognized that it was very secondary, even an insignificant threat. It now may come back up. It comes back up in France. I don't mean that it's finished at all. It came back up in Toronto. I just mean that living in fear turned out to be a very bad policy, and living with hope turned out to be the right way to play the cards, the right way to play it. And for that reason, I'm inclined to be hopeful, even though I'm temperamentally pessimistic. I'm historically optimistic.
I think that's a great note where we could end off tonight. I have to say, while I was going through grad school, the financial fortunes of a grad student rise and fall, but the one thing I would never give up was my subscription to the New Yorker, because I would miss the articles of Adam Gopnik.
Oh,
This is a true pleasure and a true honor to have the opportunity to have a conversation with you. Thank you to everybody who tuned in from near and far. I saw people signing up from the United States, all across Canada. It's really fantastic. Maybe the silver lining of the pandemic is that we get to have conversations like this on issues that really matter. And I have to say, there's a real chance that we might have to find a segment of the Words Festival that we call talks, Rhino Dialogues or something along these lines, because you've made such a compelling case for this.
I would love to come back to that. This was a wonderful chance for me to talk. I can't thank you enough for your questions and your conversation. And if I can add only one thought, because it relates to the question of liberal institutions. Don't cancel your subscription to The New Yorker. One of the reasons that The New Yorker persists is we now depend almost exclusively on our subscribers to support the magazine. That's the business model that we've come up with. So our subscribers are our lifeblood. Our subscribers are our foundation. It may be one of the few plausible models for a free press going forward is to turn to our subscribers for support rather than to the advertisers who have fled to Facebook. So calling yourself a subscriber to The New Yorker is to be a citizen of The New Yorker. And I am deeply, profoundly grateful to you and everyone else who supports us in that way.
Thank you very much. The book, definitely go on our website. There's a bookstore to buy the book. Adam Gopnik, thank you very much for joining us at the Word Festival.
All my love to all in Canada, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And good night, everyone.